everybody. I'm Ashleigh Banfield, and this is Drop Dead Serious. And Alex Murdaugh is coming back. Like him or hate him. He's getting a new trial, folks, in 2027. And I think things are going to be different. I have egg on my face from the last case because I said, ain't no way this Becky Hill business is going to stand. They're going to call a mistrial. They didn't. And he was convicted.
So she explained she had a financial incentive for a guilty verdict. She also made comments to her like, don't be fooled by the evidence presented by Mr. Murdaugh's lawyer. Watch him closely. Just before he testifies, look at his actions, look at his movements.
And it went to the Supreme Court, and they decided, yeah, it was a bad thing that Becky Hill did these things with these jurors, and that conviction shouldn't stand. So he's getting a retrial. So the question that I have for you is, and the news that's being made is, could he get a fair trial now that everybody thinks he's some orange jumpsuited monster who was convicted of murdering his son and his wife? How can a high-profile case with a conviction get a really fair and unbiased jury? Because that has raised its ugly head already in just the hearing that happened this week. And I wanted to tell you a couple of things and actually show you a couple of things to see if you feel the same way that I feel. For instance, Alex Murdaugh came in for a pretrial hearing. Yeah, we're at it again, getting ready for next year, in an orange jumpsuit and shackles. Listen, that's kind of the way it usually is. If there's no jury in the room, typically you come in your jailhouse garb, right, for the pretrial hearings. But if you're a really high-profile case and the cameras are on and it's going out on the 6 o'clock news and the podcasts, it means everybody's seeing him as an inmate, prisoner. Gotta have done something wrong. That's what most people think. And so the Luigi Mangionis of the world and the OJs of the world, a lot of times they can come in and they can dress in street clothes so that there isn't a poisoning of the jury pool. And that is exactly what Alex Murdaugh's lawyers said this time around in the pretrial hearing. Take a look.
Jurors, potential jurors, are watching this right now. It's going to be, wherever this goes, it's going to be difficult to get a jury. And to the extent that parading him around in a jumpsuit shackled like an animal impacts their view, it's going to make it more difficult for us to get a jury. Now, again, Mr. Waters' argument is specious. He's not dangerous. The only thing he's been convicted of is stealing money. Now, Judge Newman let him come to the courtroom in street clothes and unshackled. I know Mr. Waters feels compelled to get every advantage he can, but this is one that this is our ability to get a jury. So I would ask that he be allowed to come in the courtroom unshackled in, I will call them, street clothes. There's this. I mean, chained around the waist, chained in the hands, chained on the feet. I mean, this guy is not a serial killer. He's not, Ted Bundy.
You can sit down, Mr. Murdaugh.
Animal. Wow. That's big. Yeah, okay, smart, I think. Very smart. Because in heading this off at the pass, Dick Harpootlian is effectively saying, this guy can't get a fair trial. Stand up. Show everybody. Do you see how unfair this is? Like, he's putting it out there so that it's not just dangling in the background. He's saying the big elephant in the room is none of this is going to be fair. None of it. Everybody's already decided on my guy. And that effectively tells people like, oh, maybe we shouldn't have, right? So really critical little maneuver, I think, on the part of Dick Harpootlian. And I think the judge will probably acquiesce, too, and say, you're right. When he comes in next time, he should probably be in street clothes. And the other big issue that I think we're going to see in trial number 2 is DNA underneath Maggie Murdaugh's finger. In the first trial, there was a little bit, made of that unknown male DNA. But years and years later, we're better at determining DNA. Even if it's teeny tiny, like Koberger status, right? This almost imperceivable tiny speck of DNA underneath the knife sheath, well, they got a whole profile built out of that. And that seems to be maybe where Alex Murdaugh's lawyers are going now. that little tiny speck of unknown male DNA, they don't want it to be just unknown male DNA. They want it to be known. Who is it? Because if it's somebody who matters, who's weird or strange or a potential killer, that could be the whole ball of wax. Here's how it played out in the pretrial hearing.
These murders happened in 2021. We're in 2026. 2021, there's no such thing as artificial intelligence. In 2021, this genetic genealogy was just on the ground floor. In 2026, we are light years ahead. And so what we're asking for didn't really exist in 2021. It does exist today, and Othram is the leading lab that performs this analysis. They did last year, in 2024, the statistics are that they cleared 200 cold cases on behalf of law enforcement around the United States and the country. They work with law enforcement every day. The most high-profile case they did was at the University of Idaho, the Moscow, Idaho murders. That's how they solved the Moscow murder cases, was through Othram Lab. The difference between, and they say they don't have enough samples to get through CODIS, and I've talked to the lab about that, and that's not an issue. I do want to address this red herring argument. The DNA that we're talking about, Your Honor, came from Maggie Murdaugh's left fingernails. That was tested by SLED with this STR analysis. The DNA sample number 70 that we're asking to be tested, it positively was not Alex Murdaugh's. Any of the other folks who they took buccal swabs from went through a long list, not them, except for one potential, and that potential, the ultimate result was it's 11 times more an unknown male, so they know it's a male, than it was this person. That's how they do things in their DNA analysis. And Mr. Waters said, well, there's no evidence of struggle, but there was a shell casing under Maggie Murdaugh's body from the gun that killed her. I mean, that shell casing and that gun had to be in very close proximity. Maggie Murdaugh's cell phone was missing from the crime scene. Was DNA transferred at that point in time? And so we don't think it's a red herring. We think it's very important. Now, it may turn out to be, innocuous. We don't know, but it's worth looking into.
Okay, I haven't said no. This is what I do want you to do, though, Mr. Griffin. I want to know how long it's going to take to analyze what it is that you're asking for. And even if I expedite it, I'd like to know how long it's going to take. And I'd also like to know if there's even a viable sample that they can get. And we will discuss this at our next pretrial.
So really interesting that we may have a lot more science being applied to that little speck of DNA under Maggie's fingernail and a name associated, because honest to God, that could make all the difference. And don't just ask me, because I've got one of the smartest legal minds joining me on the podcast today. If you have watched The Lawyer You Know, it is a podcast by Peter Tragos. He's really, really good. He watches these cases, and with the lawyer's mind, he's able to do analytics on these cases and actually look ahead and tell you why something may or may not be about to happen, or why it did happen, or whether this was normal or not normal. He's just got a really good mind and a good eye for this. So I've asked him about a lot of this stuff. And our conversation was super interesting. He and I actually differ on a couple of things, which is fun because I don't know what I'm doing and he does. And so I asked him, tell me where I'm wrong. So I asked him about the trial that's coming up, Becky Hill, how she's thrown a wrench into things and whether her wrench is coming back. I asked about Buster. I asked about the last judge and what happened in the last case and how much of that is going to happen in the new case. And then maybe the most important, I asked if Alex Murdaugh actually has a shot of beating the rap. And you won't believe what Peter said. Here's our conversation. Peter, thank you so much for being on the podcast. It's good to have you.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here.
Let's talk Murdaugh. Those are words I didn't expect to be uttering now in the summer of 2026.
Yeah, we're back for round 2. I think it's justified that we're having to do this again, even though it's brutal on everybody involved.
I mean, brutal is, people don't realize that you might go through the machinations of retrial and the court hearings to, establish the reasons for it. But people don't realize there are real emotions behind this. There are victims who were trying to put this behind them, move on with their lives, and here it all comes up bubbling again. That's the real drama behind courtroom, activity that most people don't really think about.
Yeah, I think with a case like this, especially where the defendant is related to the victims and the people that support the defendant maybe and support the victims can be very intertwined, have interfamily relationships and friendships that are very different than most trials, right? And a lot of times it's the victims hate the defendants. Maybe some cases the defendant's family hates the victims if they believe the defendant to be innocent. But here there's just so many different emotions going on with everybody involved in what feels like a small town, although it's not necessarily such a small town with everybody that's involved in this case. But that's the feel that it has. So many people were affected by this. Their lives are turned upside down by trial number 1. And now we've got to do it all over again.
It's so funny you should say that, because I've always said, if you do what we do for a living and you spend some time in courtrooms for dramatic crimes where there is so much emotion involved, it's almost like a wedding. You've got the people sitting in the gallery behind the defendant, usually your family, friends, and supporters, and then the others who support the victims are on the other side. But when you have a case like this, it's very confusing. I think in the first trial, it seemed that Buster, the only surviving child of Alex and Maggie, was sitting in what seemed to be a family support group. And then I think things might have gone sideways. Are you aware of how Buster's sort of floating into the mix now as we approach a retrial?
I really don't follow a ton of that, of what's happening outside the courtroom or in addition to the evidence that's argued in the case and the decisions made by judges. So I never really know. I've been involved in cases like this and represented clients that have been accused of doing horrible things. Some of them end up victorious and vindicated at the end. Some of them don't. And it can be very difficult for their family members to wade in the waters, especially if they believe them to be innocent at some point or just can't believe their family member would do something like this. Even the Alex Murdaugh supporters that believe maybe he's innocent of these crimes, they're in a difficult position because he is a convicted felon at this point for committing fraud and stealing money from all sorts of vulnerable victims. Just a horrible, horrible thing to do from somebody in a trusted position of authority, that even if he's innocent of these, you're still coming to grips with the fact that he is a horrible person that made horrible mistakes and horrible decisions throughout a lot of his life. So even if you don't think he committed these crimes, it's hard to fully support somebody like that, even if you're a family member.
And yet you hear those arguments, look, I may be a liar and a thief, but I'm not a murderer. And that's probably what, Alex's lawyers are going to do in this particular case, because as you said, he's a convicted felon. And that is part of his story. And that is, and you tell me if I'm wrong, that is going to raise its ugly head in trial number 2. You can't just exclude that. That's the picture of who he is. And it's very intertwined into all the things that happened.
So I think that there may be a part of this trial that does dig into the financial crimes. I think it's going to be much more limited than we heard in the first trial, based on the Supreme Court's ruling and based on the fact that the most recent status conference, this judge said, this is a new case, this is a new trial. Whatever orders, whatever rulings were done in the first trial, those are from the first trial. And based on the fact that the appellate court overturned that case, I am going to make my own rulings, my own orders. This is going to be a fresh look at this case. Don't assume I know what happened in the first trial. Explain to me what the context is, because trial 2 is its own beast.
Do you expect that the jury in trial number 2 is going to get at least a rounded and fulsome picture of the kind of person that Alex Murdaugh is and what he did to people, leading up to what many have said is the motive behind the killing of his wife and son? And it's, to deal with the financial issues that he was, suffocating under. Do you think that the jury's going to hear enough? And I get you when they say they're not going to hear as much, because that was the smackdown the first time. But do you think they're going to get a full picture of what Alec did and the words convicted felon?
I don't necessarily know that they're going to hear the words convicted felon, but I don't know. It depends on what your definition of a full picture is, right? So I think if it were me and I was the judge, I would allow something like Alex Murdaugh was stealing money from his clients, and the financial person at his firm found out about it, and everybody was breathing down his neck, and there was a big hearing coming up with the boat case. And if Maggie and Paul found out about it, that would turn his life upside down. He needed a distraction. That's why he went and killed Maggie and Paul. Something like that. If they're going to say it was the motive, then connect it completely to the motive. We don't need to hear how, now listen, despicable, horrible scumbag behavior to steal money from paraplegics, people that were injured in fires and crashes, people that were handicapped because of what happened to them, people that had special needs, and everybody that he stole from. Horrific, brutal, scumbag behavior from Alex Murdaugh, not relevant to whether or not he killed Maggie and Paul, in my opinion. And it seems like the Supreme Court of South Carolina agreed with that, which is why they explained that just too much of the financial crimes came into this case that were not relevant to the actual murders. And I think that a limited version that lets you understand that he was in the midst of this web of lies and theft, and it was all coming to a head, and he needed to do something to distract from that or buy more time, and that's why it was the motive. I think that's appropriate. Anything more to make him look like a generally bad guy that is willing to steal from people. And if you're willing to steal from people, especially these people, then you must also be have the propensity to commit the crime of murder. That's what we want to stay away from.
On the other side of the coin, and I always come at this from the non-lawyer's perspective, literally from the professional juror, you know. If I were prosecuting this case, I, honest to God, would not bring the financial issues and the strains and pressures as a motive, because I'm sorry, there is no financial pressure big enough to take a gun and shoot your kid in the face and shoot your wife in the face and do that in front of, you know, I could never wrap my head around motive in this case, and I know that you don't have to. I know it's not part of procedure. Motive is not an essential issue, but jurors want it. You know, people like me, lay people, are like, you got to give me the why here, help me out. And if you try to tell me that the why is that he was dealing with financial pressures and there's no big insurance payout here, you leave me in the dust.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because it also comes down to what did that do to solve his financial crimes problem? Like it didn't. It delayed it for like a week or a month or something like that. It doesn't make him go away. He didn't kill. And to me, it's more common in legal cases when that's the motive. If he would have killed the financial person, the CFO of his firm that found out he was stealing, then that makes sense.
There you go.
In Paul's side, yeah, it doesn't make as much sense. And a lot of people, lawyers will say, you know, motive is not an element of the crime, but it's the only element, right? Sometimes if you can prove a good enough motive, and I think there's twofold. There's some strategic reasons why the prosecutors in this case want to get the financial crimes in. I don't think they have another motive. So they're trying to find some motive, and they say that. And if you listen to some of the jurors in the first trial and some of the reports out of it, that motive did work, and they did think the financial crimes were motive enough, because I think, like you said, jurors want a motive and they're looking for a motive. But I also think they are trying to use the generally bad guy rule, that he's a scumbag and a thief and a felon, and therefore he's also a killer. I do think there was a bit of the inappropriate propensity argument that was made during the first trial.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think if I were the defense in this case, I would definitely say a thief and a liar does not a murderer make. Mm-hmm. And also, I would hammer that home. This isn't a motive. These people over here, these prosecutors, are trying to make you think that because this multimillionaire was struggling, the answer was to off the most important people in his life for no financial benefit. Like he wasn't going to get anything out of this. And then I would hammer the fact, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, we don't know what happens behind closed doors. We don't know, what circumstances are. So don't tell me unless you have a motive. This is not a motive. These people looked happy. They were joking about a dog and a tree right before suddenly the most heinous murder. It just doesn't make any sense. So go home with the fact that you don't always know the motive. But here, this isn't one.
It's interesting. It all depends on the juror, right? Because your take on this is a very interesting one to me, because I think that people sometimes search for what they want and they'll attach it to it without giving it, a logical thought or a discerning thought, which does this really make sense? Like, what did he gain from it? Because I think the fact that they didn't have a motive, there were no text messages or, one of Murdaugh's friends that came forward and was like, oh yeah, he was cheating on Maggie, or he told me he was over Maggie and he needed to get rid of her and he didn't want to give her any money. Like we've seen in other cases where relationships go down the wrong path and the husband doesn't want to share the money or whatever. Recently, we've watched trials where that's been part of the motive for the murder in this case. But when it comes down to it, and the defense wants to make that argument, and for a juror like you, that argument may work as a logical argument. The problem is, research shows whenever you can bring other bad acts or other crimes into a case, the conviction rate skyrockets. Because once they believe somebody, when you walk in and you see a defendant sitting next to a criminal defense attorney, most jurors think that person's guilty. And trying to get them to understand the presumption of innocence is such a big job for a criminal defense attorney. So they already think he's guilty. Then they find out, well, he's committed all these other crimes. Then they find out he did it to very vulnerable people. Then he found out he did it to people that are his clients, that he's friends with, that he's loved. And guess what? That connects to, then he can also do this horrible thing to people that he loves that surprises everyone that no one saw coming. It is a prototypical propensity argument, which is why it's not an appropriate argument, because that, just like you said, a thief does not a murderer make. And that's exactly what the law is.
Yeah, but I guess you're right. When it comes right down to jurors, they have a gut, and they are often encouraged not to leave their common sense at the door and to use their gut. And if you think someone's a bad seed, that seed can grow into a worse seed.
And this is not hating on jurors, right? They're human beings.
Right.
They have souls and they have feelings, and they're going in there and they're like, this is a horrible person. Are we going to put him back on the streets? Because they may not know he's in prison for the financial crimes or whatever. They're not going to know all of that context. So they're thinking, do we really want to be the people to put this guy back on the street if we feel like there's maybe enough evidence that maybe he could have possibly done this, which is obviously not beyond a reasonable doubt. And I'm not saying the evidence won't get there, but there are some jurors, I think, that really feel that the heaviness of that decision, and I understand it.
Yeah, and a lot of them are thinking, why are we here? Give us some goods. And the minute they start getting the goods, they hang their hat on those goods right away rather than say, I'm not so sure about that. But you bring up a really good point, and that is prior bad acts. That's just a huge element of trying to suppress evidence in a case, right? And in this particular case, you don't even need to bring in prior bad acts because we have a defendant who is high profile. And that's usually a big fight, right? It's a big effort to get past a high-profile defendant. Oh, my God, what are we going to do with jury selection? Oh, no, everybody knows the facts of the case before we get into the courtroom. But now you don't just have a high-profile defendant. You have a convicted high-profile defendant. Everybody and his dog either heard about it on the news, heard about it on a podcast like this, or saw it on Netflix, any iteration of streaming series that was out there. And so you got to get past both of those aspects, high profile and already convicted. So as a defense attorney, what's the strategy? Because it's different than most other cases.
Yeah, it's really difficult. I mean, the number one strategy is going to be finding out if these people already think he did it, right? Not just watch the Netflix series, not just listen to a podcast like
Believed
this.
it.
Do you think he did it? And if the answer is even probably, then they got to be gone, right? So that's the first thing, is figuring out who's already made up their mind in this case. Then you got to figure out who are the most open-minded people, who are going to be the people that maybe can hear something bad but not connect it automatically, kind of like you said earlier, where, okay, maybe he did some bad things. It doesn't mean he did this bad thing. So that's really what you're looking for, is to have those kind of open conversations with jurors. And that's why I think having the decision about the financial crimes and the other bad acts before jury selection is going to be really important. Judge Newman kind of saved it, didn't know how much we were going to get of it in the trial. Now you have these jurors and you're dealing with it on the fly. It would be much easier to handle that discussion in jury selection, to try and have some of the conversations like, hey, this guy stole money from his clients. Is that going to make you think he automatically killed his wife? Like, from that perspective, if you can have those conversations in jury selection, I think it's a lot easier to understand what are they going to think about him when the bad information starts to come out. And really, jury selection needs to be an information gathering section where just tell me as much as you can. Let me get a vibe. Let me get a feel. Let me see how you're going to look at the facts of this case. Are you going to be fair? Are you going to give him a fair shake? That's what you do.
Listen, a lot of lawyers, a lot of people will say trials are won and lost in jury selection. And this one, again, because of these two really bizarro aspects, super high profile, that's rare, and already convicted, that's rare. Do you think they should be bringing in more than just a jury selection expert, maybe like several, maybe like a team. Like this might be the most important part of this case. So throw the money and the expertise at this part, at jury selection.
Yeah, I think that jury selection is the most important part of every trial, and the differences in what you're allowed to do jurisdictionally, like when I've tried certain cases in state court and we're allowed to ask tons of questions, do research, do background information on them, and then in federal court sometimes we don't get to ask a single question. The judge asks all the questions, or the judge limits what we can find out about them behind the scenes doing, social media research and things like that. And it can be a very different jury, a very different result. So that is a very important, probably the most important part in trial. I would agree with the lawyers that you're mentioning before. This all depends on strategy, right? Certain people, a lot of old school lawyers don't like jury selection experts, and they've got some older school lawyers that have hundreds of trials between them. They've got pretty good understanding of how to pick a jury, understanding of the people that are going to end up showing up for this potential jury pool. I would think they're going to have somebody helping them. There's a lot of good research tools you can use where even me personally, I like to do a lot of the courtroom stuff myself when I'm picking a jury. I like to talk to the jurors, look into their eyes, have conversations with them, build a rapport with them, see what kind of feeling I get from them. But I do like having a jury selection expert, a jury consultant there with me who's also listening, taking notes, having a team background, doing social media research. What is this person like? What is their vibe? Are they making certain kind of comments that would make us feel one way or the other, especially if you're in South Carolina and you can look up, are they commenting and talking about Murdaugh or other true crime cases? That would be something very interesting to me. And then I like to go compare notes. So it's kind of like for a sports analogy, it's the analytics versus the eye test. I think both are really important in jury selection.
Well, I got to be honest with you. Like, I've been at this forever. I'm super old, and I'm like, this is year 39 of coverage. Yeah,
That's
so
wild.
shit.
A lot of experience in that. Yeah.
And I got to be honest with you, things is not like your grandpa's day. You have podcasters now, and you've got pro-burgers, people who are pro-Koberger, and they're just a strange sect that digs in, and those are part of the jury pool potential, right? So I sort of feel as though jury selection isn't just something you need an expert for. I think it's now almost a science, and I feel like it's a growing science. And in particular, with a guy like this, the potential for a stealth juror is overwhelming. And identifying stealth jurors isn't just about questions. It's actually about body language. It's about all these other things, because these folks mean business. So what do you make of trying to identify stealth jurors in the day and age of digital media, don't fuck with cats, podcasters galore, and angry motherfuckers who just believe that Brian Koberger's innocent?
Yeah, the Mangione fans. I mean, there's definitely a lot of interesting types. And I'm not saying you can't fight for somebody you believe is innocent or presume somebody innocent, but it goes to the level where even if they plead guilty, people still think, they're not, there's a conspiracy. And I understand, and people dig in. Here's what I'll say, a couple of things. I would still say it's more of an art than a science, personally, from my experience. And I think that the stealth jurors that are going to support criminal defendants, regardless of if they plead guilty, if they obviously did it, if there's, overwhelming evidence way beyond a reasonable doubt, those are a lot easier to pick out if you can actually talk to the jurors, whether it's individual voir dire or you talk to the entire panel as a lawyer, able to ask questions, look them in the eyes. I like to ask certain things that maybe give me an indication, like, what podcasts do you listen to? What Reddit channels or pages or groups are you on? Where I can get more information about that and understand, maybe, and not everybody's the same, but maybe they think a certain way if they really love this podcaster or this YouTuber versus another one. And, from my perspective, there's still a lot of information you can learn. People usually do show their hand. I think that stealth juror is easier to pick out because it may be an intentional stealth juror versus somebody who really doesn't know their bias of, yes, I think everybody that's guilty, everybody that the cops arrest is guilty. Sometimes people didn't even know they have that bias until you're sitting there in jury selection. So sometimes that's a harder one to pull out than I'm going to try to get in here and make sure I get on this jury because I want to be the reason, there's a hung jury and, this podcaster is going to be talking about it for the next 2 months. I want to be the reason for that. I feel like that's easier to pick out either before the trial, during the trial, or even during jury selection where some jurors are like, this person's making no sense. But even sometimes that can create a problem you can't fix. Like some people believed that to be true in the first YNW Melly trial, but there's no real way to prove it.
Let's talk about what's really in your makeup. Most of us spend a lot of time worrying about what we eat and what we drink and how we take care of our families, but then we cake our faces with makeup full of chemicals that we cannot even pronounce. Your skin is your body's largest organ, so whatever you put on it is absorbed. And that's why I use Toups & Co. Here's what I love. Their liquid foundation and face primer, they don't just cover your skin, they actually nourish it. Most makeup requires constant touch-ups or it leaves your skin feeling heavy and clogged, but this stuff feels incredibly light. It doesn't cake and it actually lasts throughout the day. So if you're tired of using makeup with mystery chemicals, you don't have to anymore. Simplify your routine and actually feel good about what you're putting on your skin. Head to toupsandco.com/Banfield. They're offering my listeners 25% off your first order with the code Banfield. That's toupsandco.com/Banfield. And use my code Banfield for 25% off your first order. You could just click the link in the description. Well, I'll tell you what, in this last hearing, Dick Harpootlian, who's Alex Murdaugh's lawyer, he wasn't mincing words. Let me read this. He said, potential jurors are watching this right now. Bringing him in a jumpsuit, in shackles, like an animal, impacts their view, and it's going to be more difficult to get a jury. And then Alec, as if on cue, stood up so that Dick Harpootlian could show the judge the shackles and show the, obviously the cameras too. So it's a show, 100% in both regards. It's a show because the cameras are on and potential jurors are seeing this guy in a jumpsuit and shackles. Not good. Add that to the fact that he's already been convicted on camera. And then it's a show when Dick Harpootlian does that to sort of almost flood the zone with that information to make sure that people are talking, you and I are talking about it.
Yeah, I think whether or not Dick Harpootlian wants it to be a show, it is. So if it is a show, a good defense attorney needs to understand it can't just be a bad show for his client all the time, because that's what it'll be. If defense attorneys act like it's no show and there's no cameras there and the publicity doesn't matter, that's a loser argument. Like, good luck with that. You may have people talking about, wow, what a stand-up guy you are, but I would never want to hire you if you don't understand how to deal with the cameras and the publicity, because he's right. He pointed at the camera, and of course he's going to put on a show. He's going to be Dick Harpootlian. He's going to do the way he does it, but he's right. The camera's watching. They see the orange jumpsuit. They see the shackles. He's like, he's not some serial killer, and everything he says is purposeful and intentional, right? He's like, he's not some serial killer. He's not dangerous. He's just been convicted of some financial crimes. That's going to be right in line with the argument he is going to make that you've already, discussed at trial, that just because he stole money does not mean he's a dangerous killer. And so he's starting to plant that argument now, where if there are jurors watching, they don't just assume he is a killer, a serial killer, a horrible animal because of the way he's sitting there before this trial. So I think that I get it. I get why people eye roll it. I get why people are frustrated by it, but you have to deal with it. And every lawyer deals with it a little bit differently. And this is the way Dick Harpootlian is going to deal with it.
I don't think it's a bad idea. The elephant is in the room. Mm-hmm. So if you just charge that elephant, then maybe people will be a little bit more sympathetic to something that's usually just, noise in the background, that gut you have, the feeling you have when you see the orange jumpsuit. No, scream out loud, put it out front, ask people to recognize this thing isn't fair, what you're seeing. So I don't think it's a terrible idea. It works for Trump, right? He's like all about when something doesn't look right, flood the zone with it. And then, everybody gets overwhelmed, and then there's another issue the next minute.
I think there are definitely people in this world that are significantly better at handling cameras and media than other people. And there are people in this world that no matter what you do in front of a camera, people are going to have their feelings. So I think there's a lot of people that don't really care. And I think Dick Harpootlian is one of them. He doesn't really care if people say he sucks, he's so annoying, he's a scumbag, or he's the most brilliant, most amazing lawyer ever. I think what he wants to do is make sure that he's fighting the narrative that Alex Murdaugh did this and we're just waiting for him to get convicted again, just like he was convicted the last time. That's, I think, the narrative he cares most about fighting. And he doesn't really care about what people think about him. He cares more about the narrative of the case.
Peter, everybody thinks I'm crazy because I'm of the conviction that Alec didn't do it. And I believe that because of my gut and what normal human behavior indicates. This is a man who was down at the dog kennels bending a tree and talking about what they're going to do with the tree, and then over talking about the dogs and how the dogs got an issue and we're going to have to fix that. And suddenly he becomes one of the most heinous, violent, family annihilators. It doesn't make sense to me. And not only that, just the actual forensics of using two long arms and boo, boo, and boo, boo, and getting both people, in one of the most painfully, emotionally violent ways, shooting your family in the head and face. I mean, for all those reasons, it doesn't make sense to me. I can't put the pieces together forensically. I know there's some bad shit, some cell phone activity that shows him there and, has him running and doing all the rest. But I don't think it's so off base to think that Alex Murdaugh was in deep with drugs. We know that, was in deep with dealers, and they came to collect and said, you know what? We know you got one more kid. So you want this to happen to them? You don't say a word about who did this. And that seems plausible to me. Why am I so off?
Yeah, I think that this is definitely not as open and shut of a case as some people feel because he got convicted the first time. I think there were definite holes in the case, like the motive. I never bought the financial motive either.
No.
Now, the issue is the big lie, the Snapchat. He was right there, potentially last one with them. He definitely had the opportunity to commit this crime. He was the number one person with the opportunity to commit this crime, driving to his mom's house, acting weird, doing things with the worker with his mom was there, and she testified to, it was off, something was weird. So I definitely think there's some stuff there, right? And why did he lie? Why didn't he just say, yes, I was down to the kennels with them 5 minutes before?
Hold on. For the very reason I just outlined, let's say this is kind of cartel violence, and they have put the fear of death into him, saying not only are we going to do this to your kid, but we're going to make it longer and more slow and painful. So this is what you're going to do, Murdaugh. You're going to take the heat for this, or you're going to do whatever, but you're not going to say a word about us. Give us our money. And then you think he's going to act weird? Hell yeah, he's going to act weird. He just had his family massacred in front of him. The last surviving member of his family is threatened. And so for those reasons, I think, yeah, he does a big lie and he acts weird to try to cover up everything that's happened.
I think that's a possible inference you can make from the evidence. I don't necessarily know that that's probable. It's definitely not anything anybody has proven. But I think that's definitely an inference that the jury can make, not an inference the prior jury made. But I do think that the depth and breadth of the financial crimes that came in, there's no way to look at that not affecting that prior jury, in my opinion. I do think it's a more difficult circumstantial case. I think Creighton Waters knows that. I think the prosecutors know it's a circumstantial case. They've talked about it a lot. I think that's why they really wanted that first conviction to hold true. I think they know that this is more difficult than it may seem, but the public pressure, the public view, the public eye, the majority of the jury pool, in my opinion, is going to walk in there thinking Alex Murdaugh is guilty. So I think it's a huge and difficult uphill battle for the defense team. But I definitely agree with the way that you're looking at it, as this is not as open and shut as I think a lot of people think, because they think he's a horrible scumbag human being. And I think it is a lot of the logical, common sense elements that have created pause for me as well, where like, how did all this happen exactly?
Yeah.
And the blood spatter that is not, that's why we thought he did it and could prove it with that physical objective evidence. And then we don't have that anymore. But so much of us heard about that early in the case, which we don't realize what that does to our brains. And we start having confirmation bias that, yeah, he had the blood spatter all over him, which you would have if you shot from that close. Oh, wait, no, he didn't. And that
Right.
never actually came in at trial. Those are the types of things that when you step back, you see there are some issues with this case, absolutely.
And why two long arms? Again, that doesn't make any sense at all. Two?
And a perfect cleanup of the scene, which Dick Harpootlian mentioned that one of the law enforcement officers, I believe, or witnesses in the first case, after the trial was over, was like, he must have had help cleaning up the scene, because how could he have done that as just one person? And Harpootlian's like, that's very different than what his trial testimony was, that this was just Alex Murdaugh, and it's just one guy and there was nobody else there. And the two little people example that they gave based on the measurements and how this just doesn't make sense, and everybody made a joke out of that. But what the defense, I think, was trying to argue is the math ain't math, and this is not making sense with how this is all set up.
The other issue is you take those financial crimes, if you're Dick Harpootlian and Jim Griffin, and you say, let's talk about those financial crimes. My client is an asshole. And boy, are there a lot of people who hate him. Enough to take out his wife and kid in front of him. Isn't that plausible, ladies and gentlemen of the jury?
Yeah, you have to do that. If the judge says it's coming in, that's the argument you have to make. But you would just so much rather not make it if you're a criminal defense attorney. You would so much rather have them get the least amount of evidence about the financial crimes and how bad of a person your client is. Again, just basing it off research and anecdotally, just my own cases I've had with other bad acts evidence, it usually doesn't go well when it comes in.
Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about the DNA evidence. I'm always fascinated by this. You know, this was specifically mentioned in this last hearing. Jim Griffin said, and I'll quote him, "The DNA we're talking about came from Maggie Murdaugh's left fingernail that was tested by SLED." That's the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division. The DNA sample that we're asking to be sampled, it positively was not Alex Murdaugh's. It's 11 times more an unknown male. And it looks like the judge, said, we'll go forward with that. I promise you the next pretrial is not going to be that far away. What do you expect is about to be made of this unknown male DNA under the left fingernail of Maggie Murdaugh? Is this something where Jim Griffin and Dick Harpootlian can now say, no, we want to go Othram on this. Like, we want to go to the nth degree on making sure that we can maybe find out who that DNA is before we end up in another trial that just points to Alex Murdaugh?
Yeah, I think the judge's words were, I'm not saying no. So she hasn't fully allowed them to go do all this and make sure they're going to run down this as potentially a third-party defendant. But I think that she is going to allow them to at least try to do the testing if there is enough there for them to do the testing that they want. And I think that, like Jim Griffin argued, things are very different in 2026 than they were in 2021. They already know it's not Alex Murdaugh, so it's not like they have a lot of fear it's going to come back and be bad for them. Almost anybody it comes back for, they can make some kind of argument. I mean, let's see, it's Buster's. Well, that's her son. That's who she's with. She was probably hugging him and, the day before. So why wouldn't his DNA be there? Or is that going to be a third party defendant now for them? They're going to say, well, maybe it was Buster, whatever. Whatever they're going to do with that DNA is probably going to be, this is a third party who could have done it. Of course, the state is going to have the argument there was no sign of a struggle. There was no defensive wounds. We think this is a red herring. That's the argument that they made. But if you're the judge and you have a victim who has the DNA of somebody under her fingernails, I don't know how you cut off the. Imagine if the prosecutor was asking to do this testing. Of course, they would allow the prosecutor to do this testing. So I think the defense should be able to do this testing, and then we'll see what comes from it and how much of a stink they make, depending on what they find.
Yeah, listen, I'm in agreement. I think you don't leave anything under the table in a murder trial like this. And I'm going to just digress for a minute and say, I can't effing believe that this didn't happen right away in the middle of the last trial when we discovered the bad behavior of Becky Hill. I immediately, and I went right on the record with it saying, oh, this is it. This trial's over. This thing's going to be tossed out. We're going to have to do a second round. And then up came the judge saying, oh, no, it's curable. What? Yeah. Were you as shocked as I was? Because I felt like I had egg all over my face after I said, no way is this going forward.
No, I was not shocked. The judge, I am shocked. Generally speaking, I'm shocked at what judges find to be curable error in the middle of trial. Okay. And the problem is the majority of time they're right. Like I've seen some crazy things where judges are like, oh, no, I can correct that with an instruction to the jury. It's like, so now I have to decide, do I highlight it for the jury a second time or do I let it go? I have to keep my motion for mistrial. I have to ask for a curative instruction just to protect it for appeal. And then most of the appeals lose. So it's a very difficult process. So, generally it always is shocking to me, which is why I wasn't that surprised, especially with how Newman was running the first trial. He was doing everything he could to keep it going, keep it on the rails and get it to finality. And I think the Supreme Court, the appellate court that overturned it was kind to him, but disagreed with a lot of decisions he made throughout that trial.
It's kind of a devil's bargain because you are trying to save the state money, pain, suffering of victims, all the rest. You're trying to do everything right by keeping the trial on the tracks. But in the end, I don't even know how many trial days we had after that decision that were just a big old waste of time, effort, and money. And then, of course, this big conviction that is sitting there as, again, a very ugly elephant in the new room. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to have to sit on that bench. It's why I don't. It's why I sit out here, like in the cheap seats. But the Becky Hill factor. What do you think Becky Hill is going to be in trial number 2? A big donut, 0? Or is that going to come in some way? Because again, it's in the zeitgeist. People know.
Well, I think it's going to be a big donut 0 in the actual trial itself. I think it's possible it comes up in jury selection. If anybody heard about that, or why trial number 2 got overturned, or if they think that it got overturned on a technicality, but he's actually guilty. Like, those are kinds of questions I would like to ask if I was a defense attorney on this case. Like, do you just think it was because of Becky Hill, and but for Becky Hill, everything else was great and Alex Murdaugh did this? Like, as much as the judge will let you ask around that, I think should be part of jury selection, but not part of the trial. I don't think it's relevant. What she did in trial number 1 is not relevant to whether or not he committed these crimes.
You're right. And again, the problem is that the way we see it, the more news that goes on in a case, the more our viewers say, what's happening in that case? They can't follow it all. And then they just kind of remember big chunks of stuff. And with Becky Hill, it wasn't just one thing. There was this perjury. There was her book. There was the question of whether she misled jurors. Ultimately, I don't think she was convicted of misleading the jurors, which I think she should have been. And she, perjured herself when she said she didn't show a picture, that was sealed to jurors, but she did. So it's all a big mess.
The press,
of
I
ugly.
think it was to the press.
Or to the press, yeah. And it's just for the average person out there in the jury pool, it's just a whole bunch of, there was a bunch of ugliness with the court administration. They must have it in for them too. Do you know what I mean? It's just not a good thing to have hanging over a jury pool without getting ultimate clarity. And yet, like you said, how much of this do I want to repeat?
Yeah, no, I mean, you just got to figure out how to deal with it. That's part of being a lawyer, is you have all these different factors thrown at you, and you have to figure out how to deal with it that's not going to prejudice your client. If it's going to help your client, great. You try to use as much of it as you can. If it's going to hurt your client, you really try to keep as much of it out as you possibly can. And there's no way around that. And you're completely right. There are people that watch every single podcast, every single YouTube channel, read every single document, watch every single hearing, that know what's going on. That's a small percentage of the population at large, and especially people that get pulled within the jurisdiction to be on the potential jury. Those people have probably seen the big headlines, mainstream media. They watched it on the news. They just saw, a 5-second recap. Alex Murdaugh was in court again today, and here's what happened. And then Alex Murdaugh is convicted of killing his wife and son, and that's kind of what they hear. So that is what's sticking in their brain more than a lot of the nuance of what's happened in between these two trials.
So ultimately, when you strip away all the things that they will strip away from trial number 1, a lot of the financials, obviously Becky Hill won't be so loud and proud in that courtroom. Do you think that Alec has a shot at actually beating the rap this time around, given that you can take all those things away, but now you got to add in all the publicity that he's a murderer from round 1? I
would say he has a better shot than trial number 1. I would still put it at less than 50-50 that he would be successful, though, that it will be a not guilty verdict. I think he has a shot. I think he has a real legitimate shot, and I think good lawyers usually do a significantly better job on trial number 2, and I think he's got a good legal team that is going to completely review. And a big difference there, like, we can take depositions in felony cases in Florida, in felony criminal cases. They can't in South Carolina. But now they have the testimony of all these witnesses. That usually is a big advantage to good lawyers. So I do think he'll get a better shake this time than he did trial number 1.
But then ultimately, when you just, bring it on down to what his life's going to be, he's not getting out. He's serving, isn't it a federal sentence? I think 40 years for his financial crimes.
I want to say 20-something years is what he could be serving on the low end. So it's possible he gets out late 70s, early 80s, something like that. I remember his lawyers talking about it at a press conference, like that's when he should be getting out because those are the only crimes he committed. He didn't do this to his wife and son. So, I mean, theoretically speaking, scientifically speaking, it is possible he gets out if he gets a not guilty verdict here.
But I guess if he's got the money, and I don't know where the money's coming from to pay these attorneys, and they don't work for free. These are big hitters. Why would you deplete everything for Buster in order to maybe live 5 years freedom at age 80 to 85 or something like that, if you were able to beat this rap?
Yeah, I try not to put my hand in other people's pockets, and count their money. I have no idea where his money's coming from, if he has any, if he's paying his lawyers, if he's not. I have no idea about any of that. But I do know that I can understand. If I've made a chunk of money and people accuse me of killing my wife and son and I didn't do it, I'd probably spend every penny trying to prove I didn't do it as well. So, you don't know what's going through somebody's head, but I can at least understand that justification, why that would be important to him.
What do you think the biggest headline is going to be in this next iteration of Alex Murdaugh?
Like in the next trial or in just the upcoming litigation?
Everything leading up to it and during.
I think new evidence. I think we're going to see some headlines of new evidence. Now, what that new evidence actually is, I don't know. If I was the defense team, would I pitch new statements by witnesses as new evidence? Absolutely. Would I pitch new DNA results of, a known drug dealer was under Maggie Murdaugh's fingernails? If that's how the test comes, that's a new evidence headline. I definitely think, even the OnStar information that we got in the middle of trial number 1, new evidence. I kind of think that new evidence is going to be a theme. If you're the defense and you want potential jurors to look at this case differently, new evidence is probably a good theme for you to show why is trial 2 going to be different.
Boy, is it ever good to talk to you. You sure know your stuff. I hope I can talk to you again as we start to muddle through this next round.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much for having me.
So there you have it. And I hope you can pop your popcorn for April 5th, 2027, because that's the tentative date for the start of the new trial. And I am going to be fascinated by the jury selection. I'm going to be all in the questions that they're going to be asking this potential jury pool. What do you know about this case? How much Netflix do you watch? And HBO and whatever else. I mean, listen, that story's been on every platform, right? But it's not just about whether you know about the case. If that were the fact, OJ would never have been able to be tried, right? Everybody knew OJ. It's not about whether you know about a case or you know about a person. It's whether you can be fair. And that's the specific way of questioning people and finding out whether you smell a rat in their answers. So that's the date of the trial, but if you can't wait till then, well, you're in luck because August 14th is the next pretrial hearing date, and we usually get little nuggets and snippets of stuff in those pretrial hearing dates, and for the most part, these are on camera, so there will be something to see, something to assess, something to look at, and then you may be able to jump ahead and know where they're going with the trial. Thanks, everybody, for listening. Thanks, everyone, for watching, and remember, truth isn't just serious, it's drop dead serious.